Hey guys, what's up? It's Biscuit Horror Reviews. I'm here with a review of a 1997 New Zealand psychological horror film. I'm talking about The Ugly. Before I get into this movie, I kind of want to give a little bit of a, I guess, because I always like to give a little bit of a background to why I decided to cover this film or whatever. This is a film that has been on my watch list for a very, very long time. Around the time when I was in middle school, my family had a subscription, in-mail DVD subscription to Netflix. And during the summer, when I was out of school, I was in the summer reading program, I checked out a book from the library that was Fangoria's Best Horror Films You've Never Seen. Now, to somebody who has never seen a lot of a lot of cult films, a lot of older films, a lot of foreign films, a lot of B movies, low budget stuff. This is definitely a book that is a very solid listing of titles that I would, for the most part, recommend. I haven't seen every single title, but you can actually find a listing, a list that somebody has made on IMDb of all the 101 titles, so you don't have to buy the book, unless you really want to read those reviews. So, I went through this book in middle school, and keep in mind, I didn't really read it as much as I did read a couple paragraphs of, each section that really stood out to me. And the titles that really stood out to me that I can think off the top of my head that I was instantly interested in was this film, The Ugly, as well as Necronomicon, the Brian Yuzna film, which doesn't have a release in the US, at least on DVD or Blu-ray. I know it's on Blu-ray in France, I think. Castle Freak, Brain Damage, Maniac. I think the first Maniac Cop was mentioned in it. Baby Blood. These are all movies I eventually got around to seeing. Some of them I like more than others. For instance, William Lustig's Maniac is one of my favorite movies of all time. Black Christmas is featured in it, which I didn't really care about Black Christmas, and for a very long time, it didn't sound interesting to me. But Lair of the White Worm was also in there. Like, there are some interesting titles featured in the book. As somebody who as somebody whose whole life is horror at this point, I've got to say that, these movies are fairly well known, at least today, among a lot of horror fans. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing, because this book was published in, the early 2000s. And I'm sure at that time, not as many people would have seen something like Session 9, for example. But nowadays, almost every review I've seen for Session 9 is this overwhelmingly positive review, calling it the greatest horror film you've never seen. For instance, one movie that is featured in it is Lucio Fulci's From Beyond. And I would argue that that's his most well-known, well-received, and arguably even kind of overrated title. I'm going on a rant here, but out of all these titles, I attempted to rent quite a few of them off of Netflix. And out of the ones I actually successfully rented, I didn't watch any of them, I don't think. I do remember The Ugly showing up to my house, and me going yeah, I'm going to watch that eventually. And then I just returned it after a week because I was like, I'm never going to watch this. Here we are, over 10 years later, and I'm watching it now. The Ugly is an interesting movie because it's one of those into the mind of a serial killer movies. And there are movies that do that do pretty interesting things, or that are good films. I think some of the best ones are the Hannibal movies, specifically Michael Mann's Manhunter, as well as Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon. Now, Hannibal is one that I don't think is necessarily good, but I think it's interesting, and I can get into it, and I enjoy that movie, but I don't think it's good. Same goes for Hannibal Rising. There's also stuff like, and that's like the kind of classy stuff that isn't super violent or grotesque. It's very subdued, but as a result, it's a well-received film. Then you have stuff that's a bit more trashy, stuff like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, or Maniac, for example. Even the remake of Maniac, And the thing is, those movies are very trashy, violent, exploitive, disturbing, but they know that they're exactly that. They know that they are disturbing and disgusting and misogynistic, and they don't try to act like they are above it to get a reaction from the viewer. Then you get stuff like The House That Jack Built from last year. Probably one of my least favorite movies I saw last year. I don't want to get too much into it because I really do not want to do a full analysis video on it. But also, I should mention Shram, Into the Mind of a Serial Killer, is another one. That one is by Jörg Buttgereit. That one is also pretty interesting. It's, again, one of the kind of trashy ones, although it has some light art house touches here and there that I think add to the surrealness of the film. But The House That Jack Built is one that is trying to simultaneously be trashy, exploitive, violent, but also trying to be art. Now, I'm not saying an immensely violent film can't be art. I think Lars von Trier's Antichrist, for example, is an absolutely amazing film about the cycle of grief. And I also think that Flower, Flesh, and Blood is a very interesting film that is kind of unintentionally so about feminism. There are interesting things being said in any kind of movie. But when it comes to Lars von Trier, especially in the last few years, he's kind of just starting to make movies to be edgy and claim that they're art. And if you really want to watch The House That Jack Built, you can. I wouldn't recommend it, at all. It's very obvious the film is trying to be, tongue-in-cheek and self-aware and a dark comedy, but it's not doing it in an interesting way. It's doing it in a looking at the camera every 5 seconds and winking kind of way. For instance, the first woman who's murdered in the film is a woman who's like, "Oh, you're probably a serial killer, aren't you?" And then she gets beaten to death with a jack, like a jack to, lift up a car, by a man named Jack. Lars von Trier thinks he's funny. I'm not even reviewing this movie. So The Ugly is, like I said, one of these kinds of movies. And it kind of falls into the Shram category of it's exploitive, it knows it is, but it's playing itself, kind of seriously while also doing a surreal thing. And it's also, relatively violent. I wouldn't say it's a gore fest. The Ugly is a movie that has to do with this psychologist, and she's interviewing this, this serial killer who's in a mental institution. And the first thing I noticed in this movie is that the institution is very run down. Like, the orderlies that you see in the film they look like they are members of a fucking Pantera cover band. One of them is literally wearing a lab coat that he has cut the sleeves off of, and he keeps it unbuttoned, and he doesn't wear a shirt under it. The other guy wears a sleeveless shirt that has a target practice target on it. And these guys look like they would never in a million years even be guards at a fucking mental institution, let alone orderlies who are told to give the patients drugs to calm them down. That's literally something that happens. You also have one other patient other than the serial killer that you see, which is an older woman who wears 3D glasses, and she apparently sees things when she wears the 3D glasses. The asylum is very broken and dirty and run down. There's paint chipping off the walls. The cells are really filthy, and there's stuff carved into the walls and written on the walls. The mattresses are this thin. Then you get to the office of the main doctor of this hospital, and it is a giant glass fucking office that has a pond of koi fish underneath the glass floor. It's this super nice, fancy looking fucking office that really juxtaposes the gross, run-down nature of the asylum that you see of the film so far. Also, other than, you only see these two orderlies who look like fucking Pantera cover band members, and the main doctor of the hospital and this psychiatrist, and that's about it. And the, other mental patient and the main serial killer. But yeah, she's interviewing him and, trying to figure out stuff about him. And some things happen along the way, stuff to be expected, like, he had a messed up childhood, this, that, and the other. Some girl, like, broke his heart or something. I'm just kind of throwing out examples of what you kind of expect from this movie. Another thing that's added in the film that I think, really gives it a surreal vibe is that purely for stylistic reasons, the director decided to, instead of going with just regular blood for any of the scenes, most of the death scenes involve throats being slit and blood splattering everywhere and pooling up. The blood in the film is straight black. Like, it looks like black ink. It looks like squid ink. Like, it doesn't look like blood. And that's something that is a very interesting stylistic choice that some people have said is like, that literally represents the main character not processing that these are people he's murdering, and he's disconnected from them so much that he, people have given those reasons, and I think that that's definitely an interesting thing to go with, but it's an interesting stylistic choice. Now I'm going to actually get on to the actually criticizing the film. The acting and writing in the film is all over is pretty good. The acting from the serial killer character's mother, she goes from crying to screaming and, like, slapping the shit out of her son in 2 seconds. It's such a quick change that it is jarring. It is kind of horrifying. The serial killer character, Simon Cartwright, is an interesting character. Even if the character is kind of rife with the cliches you expect from this stuff. It plays out kind of how you expect it to. There's something that happens towards the last act that I actually think is something that really made me want to talk about it. I can't reveal that because that's a spoiler, but it's definitely an aspect that I don't think I've seen in one of these kinds of movies before. It could be interpreted a different way, definitely, but I don't think I've really ever seen something like this in a, psychological, into the mind of a serial killer kind of movie. The filmmaking, from a filmmaking standpoint, the film's pretty well made and interesting. I think it's a pretty good movie in terms of its actual quality, considering it was done on a very low budget, obviously. The camera work and editing is a bit much at times during some of the scenes of violence and, struggles and stuff like that. There's a lot of shaky camera work and jump cuts and kind of flashes on screen, and that can either make or break a film. I think a very good example of, doing kind of really sporadic, quick cut editing working is, in I can't think of a movie actually off the top of my head, so I'm just going to move on. But it's one of those things that was definitely a sign of the times. This movie was made in the 90s, and it's kind of going for a 90s, like, edgy psychological thriller, fast cut kind of editing, which can get annoying. It reminds me of, like, the editing in Fight Club, for example, how that got really, really obnoxious. Although it isn't as bad as that film. It definitely isn't as bad as Garden of Love by Olaf Ittenbach either. That's a movie that is very entertaining. In all honesty, this is a pretty damn good movie overall. I didn't get bored throughout any of it. I was pretty into it. I was glued to the screen for, most of the runtime. And I would actually definitely recommend you seek this one out. I don't think the DVD is currently in print or anything like that. Ironically enough, I actually got this through a Netflix subscription I have for myself for DVDs in the mail, because they still do that, which is kind of bizarre. But I got it, and I was like, all right, we're finally going to watch this. And yeah, I actually don't regret watching it. It's a pretty interesting movie. And, it's kind of like, I would almost compare it to the most recent film I did an analysis on, Plank Face. It's an interesting kind of into, you know, look into kind of like an almost decomposition of humanity going so far. And it also has kind of weird quasi art house touches like that film does. In all honesty, if you're into psychological horror films, if you never heard of this one, I would definitely give it a solid recommendation. And yeah, I think that is actually going to do it. I guess I should probably give this a rating. I'm going to go ahead and say this is a 3.5 out of 5. About I would say maybe 6 or 7 out of 10. Like it's a pretty decent rating. It's very enjoyable, and I would definitely recommend it. It's not a must-see film in my opinion, but if you are like me and you're looking for the diamonds in the rough, this is definitely a diamond in the rough. Anyway, guys, that's it for this one. This is Biscuitville Horror Reviews, signing off. Peace.